Well, joining me to discuss this is Kim Darroch, who is the British ambassador to the United States, and Michael McKinley, who is the US ambassador to Afghanistan. Lord Darroch first. Boris Johnson really went all out to try and extend that August 31st deadline. It's a bit of a slap in the face from Joe Biden, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a disappointing outcome, a bad outcome for the Prime Minister. Actually, for all the Europeans, because the French and Germans joined us in that pressure. I think it's what I expected. I thought Biden would stick to his deadline. And it does look, Kathy, you have to say, as if the West are being driven out of Afghanistan to the Taliban's timetable.
Well, indeed, the Taliban's calling the shots. I mean,
humiliation on the humiliation we already suffered.
You say disappointing outcome, which is a very diplomatic speak. Isn't the reality that the UK and the US went into this whole thing as allies? They've come out as virtual strangers, haven't they?
Well, it shows that we don't perhaps have the influence over this US administration that the Prime Minister would like. Nor, however, does Angela Merkel, nor does Macron. So it's not just us, but it doesn't make the special relationship look very special. You're right.
Michael.
But most of all, this is a very bad thing for all of those Afghans who are relying on us, who worked for us, who risked their lives for us, who we were hoping to get out of the country.
Michael McKinley, that's the point, isn't it? That Biden has allowed the Taliban to call the shots here to the detriment of those innocent Afghanis. Michael, I'm not hearing you. If you're able to unmute, I'll let you have a look at the technicals while I go back to.
I'll apologize.
You've unmuted.
For
Excellent.
that.
Don't worry at all. Carry on.
I'll apologize. And I would just agree with Ambassador Darroch about the tragedy that we're seeing unfold on our screens and the absolute urgency of evacuating not just citizens, but the Afghans who worked with us, not just as interpreters, but with NGOs, implementation programs, women activists, women politicians who could be targeted now, the people who worked with us on security missions. The list is quite long, and obviously time is of the essence.
Well,
if I can just
but you could have
suggest,
extended that time, not you personally, but Joe Biden could have extended that August 31st deadline, and America could have saved more of those people you've just listed.
Yeah. Yes, I just want to make clear, I'm not with the administration. I'm not speaking for the administration. And so the issue of the deadline that was set, the debate is raging fiercely here as well on whether it has to be fixed at August 31st. And clearly there were discussions at some point with the Taliban, which I certainly don't have details on regarding that date. What's interesting in terms of what's coming out, and we're at a bit of a disadvantage here because President Biden is about to speak, is American newscasts are reporting that he's stuck to August 31st as the deadline, but also requested contingency planning for going beyond that date. So I would suggest the situation may be a little more fluid. More alarming is what the Taliban have announced today.
Right.
And if, in fact, they do intend to close the road to the airport, we're in a different scenario. It will impact very directly Afghan citizens who are looking to leave, but more importantly, Afghans who assisted in the efforts across the past 20 years to transform the country,
right,
working closely with European governments, the United States, and international agencies.
Lord Darroch, the Taliban are clearly in the driving seat. Whether there's some wiggle room from Joe Biden coming, we'll see. But what if the Taliban don't deliver on their promises on women's rights, for example? Are sanctions the only option? Because we're not going to be sending troops back in, are we?
I think this is an important point, Kathy. The Prime Minister said at the end of the G7 that the G7 would insist on the Taliban living up to their promises and on right of departure for all those who want to leave. My question on this is, what's the leverage? Of course, the West potentially can sit on quite a lot of money that otherwise might go in development assistance to Afghanistan. I think that Afghan reserves, monetary reserves, are largely held in US banks. So maybe there's some leverage, but three questions. Number one, how much does the Taliban leadership care about this? Second, how much does this actually penalize the Afghan people rather than the Taliban government that emerge? And third, is that really sustainable if we face a refugee crisis and even some sort of food crisis in Afghanistan? If the Afghan currency gets devalued, if people can't afford food, people living on the streets, if there's a real food crisis, as well as everything else that's going on. So I'm just not sure how much leverage there is there.
Right, so Michael McKinley, if there isn't any leverage, it's a shameful sort of implosion of the world order, isn't it, that we're seeing unfolding right in front of our eyes?
I would suggest just quickly on the question of leverage, there is very little at the moment, but the Taliban have to make their own calculations on whether a society of 38 million that has changed dramatically since they were last in power can be run in the same fashion, and to decide, frankly, whether they're going to be able to generate the resources to maintain any sort of system of government or authority over the country as a whole. And the jury's out. We can't trust anything that's being said right now, but equally we have to work on the basis of moving with the facts and see what shifts develop in the coming days and weeks. On the collapse of the world order, I would suggest the following. The fall of Afghanistan to the Taliban is a very sad chapter and ends an engagement which involved 20 years of dealing with terrorism across the world, but also nation building exercises in Afghanistan, but also Iraq and elsewhere. There are other issues at stake right now. And the United States, I would suggest, after 4 years of a government that undermined relations around the world, is now reconstructing alliances around the world, whether it's NATO, whether it's Japan, South Korea, working on Indo-Pacific strategy, deciding how to respond to pandemics, climate change, relaunching our economy in the wave of the impact of the pandemic on us and the rest of the world. And the United States, I think, is going to be exercising hopefully a partnership role and hopefully a leadership role on many of these critical questions, which also include dealing with an emerging China and a more aggressive Russia.
Right, well, I'd love to pick up on the China-Russia point, but I'm afraid we're out of time. Lord Darroch and Michael McKinley, thank you both very much for joining us.